What's up, guys? Today I'm going to show you how to add environmental haze or fog in post, saving time on your renders. So yeah, as I said, in this video, I'm going to show you how to make environmental haze or fog or even fake depth of field using Blender's mist pass. We're going to start all this in Blender. So let's jump into Blender. Okay, so first of all, this is going to be a bit of a lengthy tutorial because I'm going to be showing you three things. One, I'm going to be showing you how to set up the mist pass and render it in Blender. Then I'm going to show you how to work with that mist pass to do what we need to do in Photoshop. And then finally, I'm going to show you how to do that exact thing in Affinity Photo. So if you're not interested in the Photoshop part, but the Affinity Photo part, go ahead and just skip to that. I'll put chapters in the description. Skip to the Affinity Photo part. If you don't know how to use a mist pass or how to set one up, start at the beginning. If you don't care about the Affinity Photo part and you only want the Photoshop part, then just watch the Photoshop part and you could just ditch the video at that point. Whatever works for you. So let's get into our actual Blender settings and get this going. Okay, so first and foremost, we have our scene. And I'm going to use the same Wee Jedi scene that I recently made just because it's already set up and it was a really good example of how we can use the mist pass here to create exactly what we want to create. So my scene is done. I'm ready to go. The last thing I want to do is set up my mist pass. I'm going to go in, find my camera, go into my camera settings, go into viewport display, and make sure you click this little checkbox, mist. After you do that, go into your world properties right here, and this little mist tab will appear. Now, I set my starting point at 0. This is the position of the camera. My depth, you want to extend out to the very end of your scene, or as far as you want your mist pass to cover. In my case, it's 221 feet, so results may vary. But make sure you set this to at least the total distance of your scene. Now, if we come over to our render view here, and we select this little drop down little triangle thing, you can preview the passes. So if I just preview my mist pass now, you can see this is exactly what we want. We have a grayscale image from white to black and various shades in the middle. And that's going to help us later tell our post apps where we want things applied. Right? But that's a good way of just previewing it. Let's switch back to combined. Now there's one other thing I want to do here. In my original scene, I set up depth of field. I just did it not thinking about if I wanted to do that in post. So what I'm going to do is go into my camera and just turn that off. Okay. When I made this scene originally, I rendered the image out with depth of field applied, and then I just ran with that. But I'm going to show you how we can fake depth of field using our mist pass, so I'm going to turn it off. Okay, so we're ready to go now. If we jump into the compositor, as previously demonstrated in other videos, this is my kind of render setup here. I have 3 view layers, and each view layer has at least 2 render passes. My base, Vaporator, and BB-8 layers each have an image and an AO render pass, and then my base layer also has the mist pass. So this is important. Once you've set up your mist pass, you have to export it. Don't mind this stuff here. I have 2 file output nodes because for demonstration purposes in another video, I set one image out to an OpenEXR multi-layer, and then I set another set out to TIFF files. Okay, so don't worry about that. Just make sure that if you're going to use OpenEXR, that you make sure that you have a mist layer, and if you're going to use TIFF, make sure you have a mist layer as far as your render passes. I've already done this, so I'm not going to render this out. Okay? I just want to show you this is the last step you're going to go to before you actually render out your files. My render's done. Let's jump into Photoshop, and I'm going to show you how we work with this in Photoshop. All right, welcome back. We're in Photoshop now. We have our layers all rendered out. Now, let's see how we can fake depth of field and add environmental haze in Photoshop. So the quickest way to add all of our layers back into a stack in Photoshop is to go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. From here, it's going to ask us to choose where those files are. In my case, they're in my desktop, in a folder for this project, in a folder for the render, and then here they all are. So I'm going to select all of these layers and hit open. I'm not going to click on attempt to automatically align, blah, 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 or create smart object. These were not handheld images that need to be aligned. I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to wait for Photoshop to open these. Okay, I think it's done. Take note of how long that took. I want to show you guys something a little bit later. Just keep in mind that took, what, about 8-9 seconds? Okay, so here we are. We have all of our render layers in here now. And I'm just going to reorganize these just a little bit. Let's take this evaporator, put that up there. Let's take our mist pass, put that up. Oops, put that up there like so. Okay, turn that off. Okay, so everything is here exactly as I needed it to be. I don't need the AO passes for this demonstration, so I'm just going to remove them. They're just not needed for what we need to do right here. So what I have is my base, my BB-8, and my evaporator layer. I'm going to go ahead and drop in the sky layer that I used, which was a stock element from Envato Elements. Go grab that. And if anyone could tell me this, that'd be great. In Photoshop, for some reason, when you import, or place rather, an image that is definitely larger than the image file I'm currently working on, for some reason, Photoshop places it smaller into your scene. I don't know why this is. If somebody could tell me why this does this, or if I can fix that or change that, that'd be great. But for as far as I know, and as long as I've used Photoshop, this has been how it is. Let me go ahead and just scale this up. It's considerably bigger in the scene. Okay, something like that ought to work. Okay, and then I'll just drop this behind the image. So now I've got my sky in there. Now, this is not a compositing tutorial, so I'm not going to spend time going through and matching the foreground to the background, getting all the saturation and all that stuff done. That's not the point of this. I just want to show you what we can do in the mist pass. In a future video coming down, there's a full compositing workflow from start to finish where we go over every single detail. But for now, we're just going to focus on the mist pass. So just accept that the background, the sky, and the foreground, the ground, they don't match. Okay? Just pretend that doesn't exist right now. Okay, here we go. So our mist pass. Here is our mist pass. Okay? As we saw before, it is a black and white image or a grayscale image. Now, in Photoshop here, it does seem a little bit more compressed, right? Definitely seems that our black extends a little bit up tighter and our white extends down a little bit tighter than it did in Blender. There might be things we can do about that in Blender to make that doesn't happen. Maybe we can use color ramps and things, but for this, it's not really going to matter for us, and I'll show you why. With this mist pass, the tendency is going to be just take that and just make it screen, maybe lower the opacity a bit. Okay. Now, in some circumstances, that might work out fine if that's what you want. But there's a couple of drawbacks. One, we have no control over the color of the mist, or the haze in this case. We also can't control how far in to the scene it starts and how far out of the scene, or how far deep into the scene it starts to fall off. We don't really have any control over that right now using this method. So we're really not going to do that. The other thing I wanted to point out, which again is a Photoshop thing, and if somebody can shed some light on this, that'd be great. I've got a fairly fast system here. And when I adjust my opacity of any layer, and I'm looking at my main window here, watch what happens when I drag the opacity down. I'm down to 0, but nothing's happened. When I let go of the mouse, it updates. Look at the navigator here. You see it in real time in the navigator, right? But on my main window, you don't. I don't see the update until I stop or let go of the mouse. And when I'm working on a 15, 20, or 50 layer composite, and I'm making adjustments to all types of adjustment layers from, blurs and hue saturations and things like that, if I'm adjusting opacity and I have to wait for it to catch up, or I have to release the mouse to see the result, that's terribly slow. I usually will start at 0 and then run my opacity up until it gets to a level that I want it. But if I can't see it in real time and I've got to stop, I have to stop. Okay, not there yet. Add a little bit more. Okay. That's frustrating. Keep that in mind because I'm going to show you something in a little bit. We're not going to drop the opacity of this layer. We're going to keep that at 100. We're going to keep this at normal. We're not even going to work with this as a layer per se. We're going to use its channels. What we are going to do is create a layer we're going to create a haze that matches our sky, right? During the day, on a sunny, this is mostly sunny day, when you look off into the distance, the closer you get to the horizon, the closer your environment will match the color of the sky. And it's different at night than it would be during the day, but considering this is a day scene with a fairly light, even though the sun is low, still fairly bright, that's what we're going to do here. So I'm just going to choose a color that's really close to the, this landscape, but also on the sky. And then we're going to fill that layer with that color. So it's not white, it's about the cloud color. From here, I'm going to make sure that my mist layer is selected, and I'm going to go into the channels. And you could choose whatever channel you want, red, green, or blue. I typically choose blue. I don't know why. I just like that one. I'm going to command click or control click on Windows in that channel layer, and it's going to make a selection. Turn these back on. I'm going to go back into my mist layer. I'm going to hide the mist layer. I'm going to go back into the haze layer I made, and I'm going to mask it with the selection I just made off the blue channel. Okay. I have haze in my scene now. I'm just going to call this haze so I don't forget. So I've got a haze layer now. And there it is. Now, I can adjust the opacity down a little bit just so I can see. See, there it goes again. I have to wait. Okay, so let's bring it down to about 60. So now we have haze in our scene. The beauty here, as you can already see, is that our haze now has color. We can control it. If we made our scene much warmer, we can adjust the haze to match that color. If we show this to the client and the client says, hey, I want it to be a warmer scene. Okay, no problem. We come back into Photoshop. We adjust all of our layers and all of our adjustments to make it a warmer scene, and we adjust the haze accordingly to match the environment. When we're just using a black and white image, we don't have that much control over that by itself. But here we do. We can make it whatever color we want. But we have more control than that. We can see here that my haze starts kind of somewhere right around here, kind of like the mid-building, and then it goes back, covers up the evaporator, etc. But what if I wanted that haze to come forward? What if the client says, hey, it looks great, but I want it to be more haze. I want the haze to come up in front of the building a little bit. Well, if we didn't do it this way, we'd have to go back into Blender, adjust these volumetrics, move everything around, re-render it, start over. But by working in post, we have a lot of control here. I can select my mask layer, hit Command or Control L to open up my Levels tab, or my Levels panel rather. Now by adjusting the output levels, I can control where that haze starts and stops, because what I'm doing is I'm controlling the black and white output levels of my mask. So for example, if I take the black output level here and I start sliding it over to the right, watch what happens to the image. I'm bringing that haze closer to the camera. And conversely, if I take the white slider and I move the white slider up, watch what happens to this area right here. You can see my haze is going further and further back until it's behind the evaporator. Right. So I can essentially make the haze closer and bring it back to it, behind the evaporator. Now, why would you do that? If it's haze, you wouldn't really want to do that. If it's haze, you wouldn't bring the haze up behind your backgrounds unless you had something else in your scene. So for example, if I had a big city or a lot more structures behind this evaporator and I wanted the haze to go a little bit further back before it actually started, for it was, say, behind this evaporator, but in front of the city elements I had in the background. That's would be a good way of doing that. But in this case, I don't need to do that. There's nothing behind this except sky. So I can leave it where it is. But I can bring it up forward a little bit, maybe have it cover a little bit more of that structure, and hit OK. And then if I decide that BB-8, I don't want BB-8 in the haze, I can just move BB-8 above the mist layer. And then I can still fine tune this. If this was too much on the sand here, I can adjust that as well. You can even, if I needed to, I can go in there and just start painting out areas in the very, very closest part of the foreground with a paintbrush where I don't want that haze to be. So we have a lot of control. Okay? But here's where you have to pay attention. If you do this and you decide, okay, I don't like what I did, or the client says, nope, too much, I don't want the haze that much in front of the building, you go back into your layer, you hit Command or Control L, and you come back in here, but now it's not the same. Your output levels are basically back to where they started, but your input levels are changed now. So if you just weren't paying attention to this and you started making more changes to this, you're compounding what you've already done. You're adding to what you've already done. And if that's not what you wanted to do, you have to bring these levels back to where they were. And that's if you can. Sometimes you might not be able to, depending on the adjustments you made previously. Then you can make these adjustments accordingly. Affinity Photo has a really cool way of handling this in a much more non-destructive way, which I believe is something that Adobe could learn from Serif on that front. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So we bring this back, we make these adjustments as we need, and then we hit OK. So now we're happy with our haze. How do we fake depth of field? And this one isn't as easy in Photoshop as it is in Affinity Photo, but I'm going to show you how I would do it here. So let's assume now that our image is done. It's the right color, all the elements are in place, everything is good to go, but now we want to fake our depth of field. If we zoom in on this image, we can see here that everything is pretty sharp, right? Even though I'm zoomed into 500%, it's all still pretty sharp, right? The foreground is the same sharpness as the background here. So how do we fake this? Well, as far as I know, there is no way to add a filter to its own layer in Photoshop. And what I mean by that is I can apply a filter to a layer, but I can't have a filter live on its own layer and affecting all the layers below it. If I'm wrong, please tell me in the comments how you do this, because I've never been able to figure out if you can do this, the way I'm talking about it. But if there's a way, let me know. Okay. So what we have to do in Photoshop is we have to take all of our layers and we have to merge them. So you can either come up to Layer and then go to Merge Visible, or the key command for that on Mac is Command Option Shift E. And that's going to take every layer that we have turned on or is visible, and it's going to merge it. Okay. I'll just call this merged. And just to prove it, I'll turn off all the layers below it, and then there it is. Okay, there's our merged layer. Now on this layer, I can apply a filter. But first things first, let's make it a smart object. Always make your layers smart objects before you do any color grading, before you do any Adobe Camera Raw, or apply any filters. This way it's non-destructive and you can go back and make changes if you screw something up or the client wants you to change something. Let's go to Filter, and let's just add a Gaussian blur to this. And I think 1 is pretty good. And just to zoom in now, we can see if I turn that off, we can see what it's done. So off, on. I hope this comes through on the YouTube video. It's definitely added a slight blur, which is pretty close to the depth of field blur that I had applied in Blender. Okay, but it's applying to the entire image, including BB-8, right? No blur, blur, no blur, blur, right? Okay, obviously I don't want that. I want this blur to happen as you get into the scene, right? It's a depth of field blur. So how do we do that? Well, we could do it the same way. I'm going to activate my mist layer, go into the channels again, same thing. I'll select the blue channel, make a selection, come back into my layer. I'm going to hide the mist pass layer. Now you can see my smart filter, my smart filters, it says, already has a mask applied to it. So if I just enter, let me do that again. I pasted the wrong color. If I just drop that color in there and deselect this, we can see what's happened here. If we look at our mask, we see the mask. But if we look at our image, and we turn this on and off, it's a little blurry, right? And then look at BB-8. A lot blurry. What it did is it applied our smart filter in reverse. So if we just go into our mask here and we invert it, now BB-8 is not blurry at all, and our environment blurry. Okay. So now our blur is being applied based on our mist pass, or in other words, our depth pass, right? Remember I said before, that's how we should think about this, as a depth pass. And we could do the same thing. If we want to bring that blur up a little bit, say more into the terrain here, we can go into that mask, Command or Control L to bring up our layers panel, and the same thing applies. If we take the output level for black and we bring that up, you can sort of see it happening. If you look at these rocks and this ground here, as I move this up, they become more blurred. Okay, because I can't move around while I'm in that screen. Same thing back here. If I zoom in on our vaporator here, open up this, and I bring the white, you see what's happening to the vaporator? Blurry, not so blurry, not so blurry, not blurry at all. We're essentially bringing the depth of our blur further out past the vaporator, so the vaporator is still in focus. Okay, I'll bring this down to here and do the same thing again. I have to keep clicking out of the layers panel because you can't do anything with that open. So same thing here. I'm going to move this up all the way until BB8 is blurred, and then bring it back down. So you have the same control. If you want to bring that depth of field up a little bit, just bring it up a little bit. Okay? And just like before, if you need to go back in and change it, you have to reset your input levels and then make whatever changes you need to make. And that's it. By using one mist pass layer, we can place haze or fog into our scene, and we can fake depth of field. And again, the beauty of this is it's entirely customizable per the needs of our project and the client, for that matter. So again, if the client comes back and says there's too much haze, there's not enough haze, there's too much depth of field, not enough depth of field, we don't have to go back into Blender and re-render this stuff. We could do it right here in Photoshop. And this applies to other things too, not just haze, not just depth of field. We can place elements in our scene, actual image elements, fog elements, for example, and we can apply these same techniques to mask their position in the scene. Okay, so if you didn't render everything as separate layers, you could do this exact same thing to create masks to place, say, fog elements or smoke elements or whatever behind certain things using this exact same technique. And we'll go over more of that in future videos. But right now, just understand this is what we could do with a mist pass for starters. It's a really powerful tool. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it for the Photoshop section of this little tutorial. If you're interested in how this is done in Affinity Photo, then stick around. Like I said, Affinity Photo has some really cool techniques, really cool tools that make this actually easier and I think a little bit more versatile. So stick around if you're interested in that. If not, thanks for sticking around this far. If you're not already a subscriber, please consider subscribing. Give me a like if you like the videos that I'm making. Let me know in the comments if I'm doing something wrong or if I could be doing something better, or if you'd like to see something specific. Just let me know. Let's start a conversation. All right, guys, stick around for the Affinity Photo. See ya. All right, guys, so here we are in Affinity Photo this time. So for those of you who are interested in using or are already using Affinity Photo, this next part will apply obviously to you, and it's going to show you some pretty cool things. If you are not interested in using Affinity Photo, go ahead. You missed your stop. You can stop the video here, no worries. But I highly encourage you to stick around. See how Affinity Photo handles what I just showed you in Photoshop. There are some techniques and tools in Affinity Photo that I think Adobe can learn a lot from. Okay, so just like in Photoshop, the first thing we want to do is add all of our layers to a stack. So in Affinity Photo, we do that by going to File, New Stack. It's going to ask us to add the images for that stack. So I'm going to navigate to that on my desktop, find that render folder, grab all the images, hit open. Just like in Photoshop, I'm not going to automatically align, and I'm going to hit OK. Now, before I hit OK, I want to kind of go back to what I said in Photoshop. When I did this exact thing in Photoshop, it took Photoshop about 8 or 9 seconds, maybe 10 seconds in total, to load all these layers into one stack. Okay, and I said at the time, take note of that. Watch how Affinity Photo does it. Ready? Okay. Done. It's done. Before you could even say okay, they're already here. That's pretty amazing to me. So let's go in to our group here. It looks all kinds of messed up because it thinks that those need to be stacked with alphas and everything, and they don't. So go to Arrange, Ungroup, And now we're working with our straight layers. Now, just like in Photoshop, I don't need the AO channels for this demonstration, so I'm going to get rid of those and just keep my mist pass, my vaporator, BB-8, and base layer. So it's exactly what we had in Photoshop. I'm going to place, just like I did in Photoshop, the background with the same image, which is a stock image from Envato Elements. Now, as I pointed out before, when you place an image in Photoshop, it brings it in really small compared to your overall image size. I don't know why that does that. In Affinity Photo, when you place your image, oh, amazing, it's actually the size you need it to be. Well, not the size you need it to be, but it's the full size of the image. I'm just going to drag this into place. And if I need to scale it, of course, I can just scale it down. I'll scale it down just a little bit. Okay, bring that in. And there's our background image. Now, just like I said in the Photoshop version, if you happen to have skipped that one, this is not a compositing video. So I'm not going to go over matching the color of the sky to the color of the ground and the building. I'm not going to do that here. The focus of this video is just how to work with a mist pass. So pretend that all this matches. Okay. Typically in a compositing workflow, I'm going to match everything first and then work with my mist pass or my haze or fog or whatever I'm going to do with this. But for now, just pretend it's already matched and we're good to go. Okay, so now what can we do here? So just like in the Photoshop version, I could take my mist pass and I can make this screen and I can lower the opacity, and that may work if that works for your particular circumstance. But just like in the Photoshop version, I said, you have very little control over this layer. That's the same in Photoshop. How we deal with that is a little bit different, right? So I'm going to bring this back up. And one thing I want to point out, remember what I said in Photoshop, how when you drag the opacity, I had to release the mouse button to see the updates in my main screen here? Watch how Affinity Photo handles this. This is real time. No matter how fast I drag this back and forth, this is real time. I don't have to wait for an update. Don't have to take my finger off the mouse for it to update. It's there. Why is this important? Well, when you're working with a 50, 100 layer composite, and a lot of times you'll start at 0 with like an effect layer, an adjustment layer, or something like that. It's common for me to start at 0 and then bring in my opacity until it gets to a level I want. If I have to constantly release the mouse to see where it is, this slows me down. If I can see it in real time as I'm dragging, that's a preferable way to work. Is it a really big deal? No. I've worked that way in Photoshop forever. But when I started working with Affinity Photo and realized that, it did catch my attention because that's really nice to be able to do that. Anyway, let's move on. So just like before, I'm going to turn this off for a second. I'm going to create a new layer and I'm going to pick a color that is close to the sky color off in the around the horizon. So I'm going to grab my little eyedropper tool, pick a color, say right around here, click on this, and that sets it as my primary color here. Now, to fill a layer in Affinity Photo, you could do this a couple different ways. You can grab the little paint bucket tool and you can do it that way. Or you can Shift F5 and just choose custom color, primary color, secondary color in painting, which is Photoshop's equivalent to content aware or history. So I'm just going to say primary color because that's the color I set, and hit apply. So here's my haze layer, right? Just like in Photoshop, call this haze. Now, just like in Photoshop, I need to mask this. So what I'll do here is I'll go into my mist layer and I'll go into my channels, and you'll notice there's a lot more channels in here in Affinity Photo than there are in Photoshop, and this will be explained later on. But for now, we'll use the blue channel just like we did in our Photoshop version. But we don't want the composite channels. More on this later. What we want are the individual, you can see they have the name of the file of the layer here, mist0109.tiff. So we'll take the blue one of this. Right click on the blue channel and say create mask layer. That's going to create a mask layer, which is a specific type of layer in Affinity Photo that we can then drag anywhere we want. In our case, we're going to drag it right onto this haze layer like so. I'm going to turn off my mist layer and look what we have. Now we have our masked haze layer, just like we did in Photoshop. And just like in Photoshop, I can now adjust this in real time where I want this opacity to be. Let's just say, just like Photoshop, I'll leave it at 60. Okay. Voila, we have our haze in our scene that matches our sky, which is what it's supposed to do. Now, what can we do with this? So in Photoshop, we applied a levels adjustment directly to the mask. And I showed you how once you applied that, if you wanted to go back and change it, you had to reset all your values because it was essentially a destructive operation. Affinity Photo does something really cool. Check this out. I'm going to grab this layer. I'm going to hit this little icon here for insert inside the selection, and I'm going to add my levels adjustment. Okay. Now, you see how right now it is inside my haze layer, but it's not in line with the mask. So if I take this and I drag it right to the end of the mask icon, you can probably see there's a little blue rectangle that shows up. If I let go, I'm now working with this levels directly at the mask level. So now when I open up my levels panel here, I've got the typical, the space, RGB, CMYK, etc. And I can choose all RGB at the same time, or I can individually work with red, green, and blue. But I also have this, alpha. And check this out. If I select alpha, I'm going to move this over here. And now I move my black point slider. Watch what happens. I'm getting the same result that I did in Photoshop. I'm effectively moving the haze closer to the camera. If I move the white output slider, same thing. I'm moving the fall off further back. So it doesn't start falling off until, in this case now, after the vaporator. Again, if I had a city in the background, I may want to do this. Maybe I want the fog to be starting a little bit further back. Okay. In this case, I'm going to move it up. So it's a little bit closer, kind of enveloping the structure, the building there. And I'm going to close it out. Now, if I turn the haze off, we can see it's covering the building a little bit. Okay. Pretty cool. Now, unlike Photoshop, if I decide, or my client comes back to me and says, you know what, there's too much haze. I want there to be less haze, and I want there to be maybe less haze in front of the building. If I double click on my my levels panel again, look at my settings. Go back into alpha. They're exactly where I left them. I don't have to start over. I don't have to reset my input values. Why is this important? Well, it's important because what if I forgot what my levels were? What if I forgot what I set it to the last time? What if I set it to a level of 10 and then the client came back and said it's too much, and I came back and said, well, I'm not even sure what I used. Well, now I can see what I used. In this case, I used 6. So if the request is to make it more hazy, I know that I just got to increase it past 6. If it's less than, then I decrease it below 6. Point is, this is non-destructive. My settings are here. I can go back in and alter them whenever I want. Apologies for the police sirens in the background. That to me is really cool, and that to me is something Adobe could learn from Serif, the guys that make Affinity. That's a really cool feature. This applies to a lot of things, not just levels. You could do this with a lot of different filters and a lot of different adjustment layers. It's completely non-destructive. To me, that's pretty amazing. Cool. Our haze is in. Now, just like in Photoshop, we want to fake a depth of field now. So we do it the same way. Sort of. If you didn't watch the Photoshop video, I mentioned in there that you can't in Photoshop, as far as I know, put a filter as its own layer. In other words, you can apply a filter to a layer, but you can't have a filter live on its own. So as I demonstrated in Photoshop, you have to merge all your visible layers, then apply a filter to that, and then hope that you don't have to make any adjustments to your composite, and then have to remerge it, re-smart object it, reapply all the smart filters. That's a pain in the ass. In Affinity Photo, this is another thing that Adobe could learn from Serif. Watch this. I'm going to go to my layer, live filter, blur, and Gaussian blur. Now, a live filter is kind of like applying a filter to a smart object in Photoshop. If I applied a live filter directly to a layer, that filter is always editable, meaning I can apply it to that layer and I can come back and change it whenever I want. The same way you'd apply a smart filter to a smart layer, a smart object layer in Photoshop. We don't have smart objects in Affinity Photo. And more on that in a future video. So now you can see this layer is by itself because I didn't have a layer selected. And I can make this as blurry as I want, and it's affecting every single layer below it. I didn't merge anything here. I can go in there and I can just turn off BB-8 or turn off the vaporator, right? This is entirely non-destructive. So just like in Photoshop, I'll set this to a value, I don't know, let's try 1. Okay. And then I'll zoom in so we can see no blur, blur, no blur, blur. Okay, same with the foreground here. Blur, no blur, blur, no blur, right? Okay, no surprise there. Oops. So how do we now tell this blur where to be blurry and where not to be blurry based on the depth of our scene, right? This depth of field. Well, in Photoshop, we made our smart object, we applied a Gaussian blur filter, and then we copied and pasted that mask into the mask of the smart filter, right? Well, similar here, we're going to go back into our mist pass layer. We'll go back into the channels, but instead of going on this blue channel and going create mask layer, we're going to go composite blue, right click, load to pixel selection. And you'll see now it's done exactly what Photoshop did when we selected the blue channel in Photoshop. Okay. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, in Affinity Photo, every single adjustment layer and filter has a built-in mask. Right? That's why this is white. You can go in here and just paint out wherever you don't want that to be blurry. So in our case, we're going to start with a white mask like this. Okay. Now I could invert this, or I could just go ahead and paint this in. And again, you could do the paint bucket tool. Just make sure that you're painting in black. Or you could Shift F5. And then again, same thing. You have custom, primary, secondary. In our case, this will be secondary color. Hit apply. Okay. Now, if we look at this and we turn the Gaussian blur layer off and on, it's a little bit blurry there, but then look at our foreground. It's a lot blurry. If you look at our mask, it's actually inverted. So if we invert it now, okay, now it looks the way our mask or our mist layer does. So if I turn this Gaussian blur on and off, see, not blurry, blurry, not blurry. You can see it a lot more in the vaporator. Up here, blurry, not blurry, blurry, not blurry. If I scroll down to BB-8 here, not blurry at all. Right? So the blur is no longer affecting my foreground, which is what we want. But it is affecting the background. If I zoom into this vaporator here and I turn this, right now it's blurred, not blurred, blurred, not blurred. Same with the terrain. Look at the rocks. Not blurred, blurred, not blurred, blurred. So we've effectively just faked our depth of field, right? Doing the exact same thing. And we could do the exact same thing as far as adjusting it. If we select this Gaussian blur layer and we add a levels, okay, I'm just going to drag this into my adjustment layer, go into master, and go into alpha. Now I'm affecting the alpha channel for that filter layer. So if I zoom in here like so, actually it's easier if you see it on this one. Okay, let's go into this levels. So just like before, if I take my white output slider and I start dragging this to the left, oops, all right, you got to be in alpha, got to work the alpha. Okay, and I drag this over. See what happens to the vaporator? Not blurry, a little bit blurry, a little bit blurrier, totally blurry. Because what I'm doing is I'm telling the mask where it is applying that blur. So again, if I wanted the blur to be a little bit further out past that vaporator, which I don't know why I'd want to do that, but if I wanted to, I can just move this up and I can make it less blurry. Conversely, if I go down to BB-8 here, which is not blurry at all, and I move the black slider up, you can see it's blurry, 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 really blurry. So I'm now telling the blur to come closer to the camera. So if I look here, and we take a look at this ground here in this droid, I know it's kind of very monotone in color, so it might be hard to see on the YouTube video here, but if I drag this slider up, look at the droid. A little blurry, more blurry, super blurry, and then look at the ground, right? More blurry, more blurry, more blurry. Same thing. I'm moving the blur closer to the camera. I'm effectively changing the focal distance of my image. That's pretty freaking amazing. Again, why is this useful? Well, if you render your depth of field in Blender, what happens if you need to change it? What happens if you do your composite and you decide personally that you don't like the depth of field? It's either too much, or it's too close, or it's too far, or your client comes back and says, we don't like the depth of field. We want that droid in front of the house to be more in focus, and it isn't. Or that droid in front of the house is too close, or it's too in focus. We want it to be a little bit more blurred out, a little bit more, behind that focal plane. You have to go back into Blender, reconfigure your depth, your depth of field, and then re-render it and start over. But doing it in post like this, you just go back in and change it. It's easy. That's it. This same thing will apply to other things too, not just haze, not just depth of field blur. You can place elements in your scene, smoke elements, fog elements, fire elements, and you can use the same mist pass to control where they are, essentially creating masks for them so they appear behind other objects. This is helpful if you didn't render everything in layers. More on that in a future video. But for now, you can see just how powerful the mist pass can be in a post-production workflow. It really opens up a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility with your composites. So that's it, guys. That's it for this particular video. I know this is a bit of a long one, but like I said, I wanted to show you how to create the mist pass in Blender if you didn't already know, how to do that in Photoshop, and then how to do it in Affinity Photo. And for those of you who are interested, I wanted to show you how Affinity Photo handles things a little bit better, in my opinion, than Photoshop for these kind of things. It's not better in everything, but for these kind of things, it's definitely pretty cool compared to how Photoshop's doing things. So that's all. As always, if you like the videos I'm putting out, give me a thumbs up. If you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing. Hit the bell icon so you know when new videos are coming out. Leave a comment. If I'm doing something wrong, let me know. I'm always looking to learn and improve, so let me know in the comments. If you want to see something specific, if you have a particular question, let me know in the comments. I appreciate that. It helps keep these videos going. All right, guys, be civil to one another. Make cool shit. I'll see you in the next one.